University of Oslo. At the University of Oslo, he got his PhD in philosophy from Harvard University, working with Professor Charles Parsons. And then he moved back to Europe, and he spent quite a few years working in Oslo at first, but then he spent quite a solid amount of time in the UK, working in Oxford.
8 years?
8 years, all right. So working in Oxford, in Bristol, and also in London, where he was appointed a full professorship, and then he moved back to Norway, where he's currently based at. So his research interests span philosophy of math, logic, philosophical logic, but also metaphysics and philosophy of language. He has published basically in, I think, if not every single top international journal in the field, at least most of them. I had to write it down in order to remember some journals he published in, like Review of Symbolic Logic, Dialectica, Journal of Philosophy, Stanford Encyclopedia, Notre Dame Journal of Formal Logic, Philosophia Mathematica, Synthesis Analysis, and so on and so forth. He's also been appointed throughout the years many fellowships and research grants, the most recent of which is the European Research Council starting grant titled Plurals, Predicates and Paradox, which is currently, is it finished already, or
It's got one semester to go.
Oh, one semester, you're almost there, guys. Hold on. You're almost done.
Uh-huh.
And it's no coincidence that he's here today to talk about Frege's context principle and Frege's Grundgesetze, since he is currently writing, and he assures me almost finished writing, a book on Frege's philosophy, where he actually, I think, well, maybe you can talk about this a little bit after the seminar, taking this broadly philosophical Fregean view in order to make sense of mathematics. So without further ado, let me give you Professor Øystein Linnebo, and his talk is titled The Role of Frege's Context Principle and His Epistemology of Mathematics. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Francesca, for those kind words. And thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. This is only the second time I'm giving a talk in Italy, so that's fun. This is, as Francesca talked about, part of a much larger project that's been going on for quite a while. And there is a book project here where this is meant to be a central part. This topic then of the context principle and its role in Frege's epistemology of mathematics is quite a controversial one when you look at what Frege scholars have had to say about it, and it's a difficult one, and I've really struggled with this material myself for many years. So talking to Francesca on the way over here, I realized that I first started giving talks on more or less this topic about 10 years ago, and I've sort of come back to the topic from time to time, trying to get it right, and I feel I'm finally getting it more or less right. So I hope there won't be questions that will yet again tear that down. Anyway, that's the topic. So let me then start just by providing a little bit of context, and then I'll tell you what my plan is. So Frege, of course, defends a quite serious, quite robust realism about mathematics, and one good place to look to get a sense of that is the following passage. So just as the geographer does not create a sea when he draws boundary lines and says, the part of the ocean surface bounded by these lines I'm going to call the Yellow Sea, so too the mathematician can't really create anything by his defining. Nor can any pure definition magically conjure into a thing a property that, in fact, it doesn't possess. Right? So mathematics is there independently of us in a very objective way. That's the upshot. But that metaphysical view of mathematics, of course, gives rise to epistemological difficulties. Right? So if there is that kind of objective mathematical realm, some sort of Platonic realm that mathematics is about, how do we come to have knowledge of it? And Frege realizes there's a problem or the need to say something about the epistemology of mathematics. And one place where it really comes to the fore is in this little passage from absolutely the center of his Grundlagen. So how then are the numbers to be given to us if we can't have any ideas or intuitions of them? Right? So the idea is simple enough, I think, that we don't perceive numbers or detect them in any other way, experimentally interact with them. So how then do we come to know about them or refer to them or apprehend them in any way? Right? So what's our semantic and epistemic access to numbers given the metaphysical view of mathematics that surfaces, for instance, in the first passage? And then the context principle is meant to, in a way, reconcile the metaphysical view with the epistemological demands that we have a plausible epistemology for mathematics. So the context principle comes up right after the epistemological question here has been posed. And it occurs 4 places in the Grundlagen, and I think this is the most crucial one. And the passage then goes as follows. So since it's only in the context of a sentence that words have any meaning, our problem becomes this: to explain clearly the sense of a sentence in which a number word occurs. Okay, so the idea then is to take this problem of how we refer to or get access to the numbers and then somehow turn that into a problem about explaining meanings of complete sentences. Right, that's going to be the idea. So take a problem that arises for subsentential parts, singular terms, how they come to refer to or latch on to mathematical objects such as numbers, and transform that problem into a problem about how sentences come to have a certain sort of meaning. All right, so that's the context. Let me then tell you a bit about my plan. So the overarching aim is simply to make sense of this context principle that comes up and its contribution to Frege's philosophy of mathematics. And part of the aim here is a scholarly one of saying something about what Frege actually meant. But my ultimate interest in it is really more of a systematic one, of really putting ideas more or less like this to use. And I think this is one of the more promising avenues, or the most promising avenue in the philosophy of, or epistemology of mathematics. And a very important stepping stone in what I'm going to do is to argue that we need to consider all of Frege's work when discussing the context principle. So it's very, very common to focus here on the Grundlagen. So the work where the one version of the context principle that I quoted comes from, and then be suspicious about the whether or not the principle survives actually into the later work by Frege. I think that's wrong, so I'm going to say a little bit about why I think the principle actually does survive into the mature work of Frege, and most importantly then why that matters. So that matters for some of the core claims that I'm going to make. So one of the claims I'll be making is that the context principle is independent of this problematic notion of content recarving that I'll explain in due course, but that many people associate with the context principle quite closely. It's independent of any kind of deflationism about reference, which other people, Dummett prominently, associate with the context principle. It looks like the better way of making sense of the context principle will require a certain easing up on the robustness of the realism that one has concerning mathematical objects. And then finally, a topic that is very central to my work, but that I probably won't have time to say much about here, but I'm flagging it anyway in case things go faster than I expect. That this works only for abstraction principles that are in a certain sense predicative, a sense that I'll explain in due course. All right, so that's the plan. I should mention also that I'm very happy to take questions of clarification as we go along. So I don't know what people's background here is exactly. Many PhD students, many people who know quite a bit of this, but maybe not all the details. So do ask me if you have questions of clarification as we proceed. If the question is too big to answer at that point, I'll simply make a note of it and we'll come back to it in the proper discussion. So don't be afraid to interrupt if there's something you're not getting. Please.
For me, it's not clear predicative abstraction.
I will explain that. It's a kind of non-circularity to that. But I'll explain that 3 slides down the road or so. I promise. Anything else at this point? Good. All right. So let's start on trying to make sense then of the context principle and the contribution it's making to the epistemology of mathematics. And as already indicated, the work of Frege, where the context principle figures most prominently, is the Grundlagen. So I'm going to start with that in a fairly conventional way, and then gradually then also make the argument that the Grundgesetz is something to be taken into account. And the strategy then in the Grundlagen is really a 2-step one. So step 1 is the step we already looked at a little bit, namely transforming this problem of how a singular term, like a number term, manages to refer to a mathematical object, abstract object that is, that we can't interact with in a physical way, causal way at least. So that problem is to be transformed into a problem about the meanings of complete sentences. Right? That's what the passage said. And I think this is quite uncontroversial in this otherwise very controversial literature on this territory, that there is some transformation of that sort. Right? So you could depict it in this way, that you have a singular term t, and you wonder how does it refer to a certain mathematical object O. And that problem is to be transformed into a problem about explaining the meaning of complete sentences where t figures as a subterm. Right? So you transform the subtensential problem into a sentence level problem. Now, one question you may already have asked yourself here is, why is the problem on the right-hand side, on the whiteboard, why is that meant to be any easier? So why is it meant to be easier to explain the meaning of a sentence in which a singular term t occurs than it is to just explain the meaning or reference of the term t to begin with? It's quite natural to think that when you explain the meaning of a sentence, you've got to explain the meaning of any expression that enters into that sentence, including then the reference of any singular terms occurring in the sentence. In which case, the problem that you're transforming the original problem into would be a harder one, or at least as hard as the original one. So no problems. Frege has thought about that, and that is the second step of the strategy that he is proposing. So I call this the elimination requirement. And it comes up in the following passage. So when we explain the meaning of each of the relevant sentences, so the ... involving t on the right-hand side, then we must, in Frege's words, reproduce the content of this sentence in other terms. avoiding the use of the singular terms whose reference we're trying to explain. Right? So you're trying to explain how does a number term refer to a particular number. You're transforming that problem into a problem about explaining meanings of sentences. And then the meaning of that sentence is to be explained then by somehow reproducing that meaning or that content in other terms, not mentioning the term t that you're trying to explain, or any term that belongs with that, like any other number term. Okay? So those two steps are meant to then be the key to the epistemology of mathematics. Now, how are we meant to, so far so good? How are we meant to observe then or respect this elimination requirement, as I called it? Well, the fact that the principles that Frege wants to use at the foundation of his mathematics, the so-called abstraction principles, they're meant to do exactly that kind of job. So these abstraction principles take the form of a star on the slide here. So one example would be the number of alphas is identical with the number of betas, if and only if the alphas and the betas are in a certain kind of correspondence. Right? So if they're equivalent in a certain sense. So in the case of number, that would the equivalence in question would be equinumerosity. Right? So being within one-one correspondence. And then you can generalize that and look at abstraction principles quite in general. That is logical principles of that form, quite in general. And then it looks like you get the effect of step 2 that you wanted. You get to eliminate the abstraction terms whose reference you are trying to explain. Because look, here you have, think of the number case, the number of alphas is the number of betas, and then you transform that into the alphas can be put in one-one correspondence with the betas. Right? So number terms then seemingly being eliminated. So it really looks like you have now succeeded in the elimination that you wanted to undertake. It's actually not so clear when you pause to think about it, and this is where the predicative-impredicative distinction comes up. So what if the right-hand side of your abstraction principle contains quantifiers that range over the kind of objects that you're trying to explain reference to? Right? So you're trying to explain reference to numbers, let's say, and then you're quantifying on the right-hand side over exactly numbers. Right? Then some of the terms that you will have to consider will be number terms. So the kind of terms that you try to eliminate. It's not so clear that merely by invoking abstraction principles you will be able to eliminate all the singular terms whose reference you are trying to explain. So this is a place where I'm stricter and differing a bit from the mainstream view that you'll find in the literature, where people don't ordinarily take the elimination requirement quite so seriously. But if we just restrict our attention to abstraction principles that are predicative, and here it comes, in the sense that on the right-hand side you don't quantify over the sort of objects reference to which you're trying to explain, then this is nothing to worry about. So here's an example of what I have in mind. I think examples are the best way to convey this. Look at the direction abstraction principle. So the direction of one line A is identical to the direction of another line B, if and only if the two lines are parallel. All right? So this direction is the very same as that direction, just in case the two lines that I'm picking out are parallel. When you look at that abstraction principle, this too has a form of star, of course. Then there is no quantification on the right-hand side, not of any kind, in fact, and a fortiori, not any quantification over the sort of objects that you're trying to explain reference to, i.e. directions. You're just talking about lines. Right? So if you restrict your attention to abstraction principles that are predicated in that sense, then the worry here is nothing to be bothered with. Right? So that's actually what I'm going to do for probably all of the talk, in fact, although there's a little bit at the end about what happens if you try not to restrict yourself in that way. But it'll be difficult enough, really, to figure out what the context principle is doing in the nice cooperative cases. So I propose we just focus on the nice cooperative cases, namely the ones of predicated abstraction principles, and look and see if we can get the context principle to work in that nice and cooperative setting. Okay, so that's going to be the strategy. The one example to keep in mind is really just the direction abstraction case. And so almost everything I will say can be just run in terms of that one example. That gives you an adequate sense of what I mean by predicated. Very good. Any other clarification questions at this moment? All right. So having set aside that complication and focused just on the nice and cooperative case, let's look at the big question. Right? So we want to explain now the reference of the direction term. So the direction of that line, or simply that direction. Right? So how come that comes to refer to a certain abstract object? And that's what we want to give an account of. And then Frege is saying that, look, let's invoke the context principle. That's the way to go. And then make sure to keep in mind this elimination requirement. But then you really feel like asking the following question to Frege, that how could it possibly help to provide an explanation? We're trying to explain the meaning of the direction of L. How could it possibly help to provide an explanation of the meaning of a sentence in which that term occurs in a way such that the referent of the term in question isn't invoked or plays no role? Right? So you're trying to explain the meaning of the ... involving t there in a way that says nothing about directions whatsoever. Now, if you say nothing whatsoever about directions, how on earth could that amount to an explanation of what it is to refer to directions? Well, you didn't say anything about directions, so how could that do the job? So that's the mystery or the puzzle that people ought to be troubled by, I think, at that point. So I think a comparison here is useful. So you're trying to explain to someone, I don't know why, but you're trying to explain to someone what it is to be married. Okay? And then you propose some sufficient condition for being married, or some explanation of what it is to be married, what constitutes marriage. But somehow the spouse doesn't figure in your explanation, or in your sufficient condition for what it is to be married. But you didn't say anything about the spouse. And of course the reaction one ought to have is that, look, that can't possibly be an explanation of what it is to be married. You left out the spouse. That's the spouse that's got to figure in the picture, otherwise whatever you said cannot have been an explanation of what it is to be married. And a similar reaction ought to be had really to Frege's idea of invoking the context principle. So there's something very odd going on here. And to try to make progress, this is the place then where I will make some textual claims in order to widen the amount of text that we look at. So not do, as most commentators have done, and focus entirely on the foundations of arithmetic, the Grundlagen, but also look at what happens in the Grundgesetze. You'll see in a few minutes that actually helps a lot when we try to look at possible ways of answering what I'm calling the big question. Right? So the structure here is that we have the big question. I hope you've all got that very sharply in mind now, why this is so puzzling. So it looks promising, but it's also deeply puzzling. Then we're going to look at 3 different attempts to answer the big question. two quite standard ones from the literature. I'm going to argue against those attempts, but invoking then or drawing then on the Grundgesetze. So that's why it's important for me to widen the textual evidence. Right, so first, next step that I'm going to take then is to argue that the context principle does actually survive into the later work by Frege. All right, so people have generally been reluctant to see much of the context principle in the later work, but some passages are remarkably like the statement of the context principle that you find in the Grundwriting. So for instance this, one can ask after reference only where signs or components of propositions or Sätze, so sentences would have been an equally good translation here, expressing thoughts. Right? So ask about reference only in the context of a sentence. It's pretty much exactly what he says in the earlier work. Right? So it very much looks like the context principle is still on board. Now the main challenge to that view, that the context principle is still in place, is really the following one. That in the Grundgesetze, something very odd happens, as all of you who know that word will know. So a sentence is now taken to be just a special kind of singular term. Right? So sentences are just special singular terms in the business of denoting truth values. And truth values are just special objects alongside other objects like any one of you. Right? So there's nothing special about sentences at this point. So to say then that we're going to explain the problem of reference of a singular term in terms of explaining meanings of sentences wouldn't really make much sense, right? Since a sentence just is a special kind of singular term. So there's no reduction of A's to B's here. It's really just moving from one A to another, right? From one singular term to an admittedly complex singular term. So it looks like the whole idea of the context principle doesn't get a foothold. So that's what bothered people and convinced a lot of people that the context principle couldn't possibly survive into the later work. But I think if you look at it carefully, you will find quite easily a way around that. So the long passage here that I'll read out for you, or at least read out most of and comment a little bit on, is probably the most precise statement of the context principle that you find in the later frame. So a proper name has a denotation or has reference if the proper name that results from that proper name's filling the argument places of a denoting name of a first level function on one argument always has a denotation. Ooh, what does that mean? So a proper name has denotation. So this proper name, say, has denotation only if the proper name that results from plugging that proper name into the name of a function results in something that itself denotes. So you can actually illustrate it by means of what we got here. So this one denotes if for any function that we could indicate by ... of blank. So you could indicate you have an argument place here, a little box where you could put an object. If that is denoting a function, then this guy denotes if a complex proper name of this sort will always denote, provided that that function denotes. And that's in effect what Frege says. And then it goes on saying something about what happens when you consider functions of two arguments and so on. Don't worry about that. Right? The key bit is really just that what it takes for one proper name to denote is that when you combine it with anything else that is denoting, that had better give rise to a new complex proper name that denotes. Right? If it always does, then, Frege says, the original proper name, my T over there, will denote. All right, so it's a little bit of a mouthful, but I think the idea when explained in the way I just did it should be simple enough. Right, so name denotes or refers if all combinations of it with other referring names refer. Right. So you see then that this is stated in a way that's perfectly compatible with the later Fregean view that sentences are just a very special kind of proper name. So it's now, if the combinations are proper names though they are, themselves denote. So you could explain what's going on here schematically in the following way. So there's step one, transforming the problem. In the earlier work, in the Grundlagen, well, we have the same explanandum in both cases. We want to explain the reference of a proper name. That problem is then transformed into the problem of explaining the meanings of other sentences in the earlier work, and transformed into the problem of explaining the reference of more complex terms or names in the Grundgesetz. And then you have the reproduction of meaning bit, where the elimination requirement comes in. This is something about this notion of recurving, which I'll come to in a couple of minutes in the Grundlagen. Whereas in the Grundgesetz, it's simply reducing a complex proper name to a co-denoting but simpler proper name. Right? So that's how you eliminate then the expressions in question. So for instance, if you look at the direction case again, so why does D of L, that's a proper name, what does that refer? Well, look at any context, like D of L equals D of L prime. That can be reduced to the simpler proper name. L is parallel with L prime. Right, so you get your reduction to some extent. That's it.
Sorry,
yes.
just to be clear about this, the simplicity requirement is supposed to be that the stuff on your right-hand side is syntactically simpler, or also that the simplicity is supposed to be that it does not contain, that the right-hand side does not contain the terms from the left-hand side?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, it could actually be pretty complex. So what you do is look at the term, look at all contexts. Now, context of complex proper names in which that term could occur. They have to denote. How do you show that they denote? Well, you take that one and say, this sentence can now be reduced to a simpler sentence. This one, in which there is no occurrence of T. Maybe I can write that like that. Right? So no T and other terms of the sort you're trying to explain. They don't figure in what you're reducing to. Thank you for that. That's very important. Any other clarification questions at this point? No? All right. There are other challenges too to the idea that the context principle remains in the later work. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to go over or skip over these. Just mention that people have been worried about compositionality here. Quite a natural worry that seems to explain the meanings of the complex in terms of the meanings of simple constituents. The context principle seems to proceed in exactly the other way. Right? So how can those two be compatible? My answer here is that they're explaining different kinds of thing. Right? So there's a distinction between semantics and metasemantics that I could come back to in the discussion here if people want. And then another challenge to the idea that the context principle survives in the mature Frege, namely that the mature Frege is really polemicizing against so-called contextual definitions. So wouldn't the context principle be affected by that? How could that survive this criticism of contextual definitions? I'll come back to some of that at the end. Since that is important. All right. So I think I'll leave the case for the context principle figuring in the Grundgesetze in the mature Frege with that. Right? So I'll on that basis conclude that we do find the context principle in the later Frege as well. and then use this now to assess a couple of different attempts to answer what I call the big question. Right? So the big question, you remember, was the missing spouse question. Right? So when the referent is missing there, how could something like the context principle provide an account of reference? And one answer to the big question that people have been attracted to, we see a lot of discussion by Dommett and by the Biophrygians, Bob Hale and Crispin Wright, is some sort of deflationism about reference. So by deflationism about reference here, I mean the usual thing. So it's somehow analytic of reference that quote-unquote T refers to T. And that's somehow all there is to reference. Right? So reference isn't a robust, rich, interesting notion. It's just some simple disquotational principle. That's really the whole truth about reference. And if you have that kind of view, you may think that the only notion we have of a term's referring, succeeding in referring, will be statable in the object language, and statable in the object language in a very, very simple way. So you wonder, what is it for a term T to refer? Well, that's simply for there to be an object X, which is identical with T. So the question of whether or not T refers is then just to be expressed in the object language itself as this very simple claim issue, something identical with T. Okay, and if that's how you understand reference, you can kind of see how the context principle could do its job. So here's one argument we may put together. It's pretty similar to what you find in Dommett, Hale, Wright, and so on. So premise one, all sentences have been assigned truth conditions that are compatible with their logical forms. Right, so take the language in which you talk about directions. You could assign quite nicely truth conditions to all sentences in that language. A certain term, the direction of this line, say, that is a singular term by relevant syntactic and inferential criteria. And then on the assignment of truth conditions that you have undertaken, the sentence that characterizes what it is for the term to refer, that comes out free. And then if your view of reference is deflationism, it'll simply follow at that point that T refers. Right? So then you can see how transforming the problem in the way we've been talking about, getting truth conditions that are stated in a way that doesn't make any mention of the relevant sort of objects, directions, that would allow you to run this argument. And then you invoke deflationism at the end and you say that, hey, that's all reference amounts to. So don't worry about the missing spouse, since you've got the criterion of referentiality to come out with. Okay. I think this is not going to work as either an account that we could be happy with of how we manage to refer to mathematical objects or have thoughts about mathematical facts. And I also don't think it's going to fit Frege particularly. Now, granted, it may perhaps resonate with some aspects of Grundlagen. I do concede that. But this is where it's so interesting to look at the richer context. So look at the Grundgesetze. When you come to the Grundgesetze, then the kind of deflationism about reference that is being invoked here is simply not an option. Right? So reference is so much richer, more interesting as a notion, as a relation, than simply what is captured in that disputational principle that quote-unquote T refers to T, and that being analytically further. Why? Well, at this point of Frege's philosophical development, the whole theory of sense and reference and how they interrelate in complex, interesting ways. Many issues to discuss here, I'm not going to go into them, other than just say that this is serious theorizing in which the notion of reference figures. So deflationism is no longer an option at that point. Another possible argument against ascribing to the mature Frege deflationist conception of reference would be compositionality. And so there's a story now about how the reference of a complex expression is to be determined from the reference of the individual parts of that expression. So given that the claim we're interested in, is there an object O to which our term T, the direction term say, refers? That involves something more than just the truth of that object language sentence. And so the deflationist option now simply makes that. Right? So that's arguing against one attempt to answer our big question, our missing sparrows question. Right? Let me pause here briefly to see if questions about
Sorry,
that.
just a question. This argument is independent of what interpretation of quantification you have.
What
So,
interpretation of quantification?
So it works
It's
both
meant to be,
for
I think,
objectual, substitutional.
It's meant to
Right.
have that kind of independence, and it's important here that we have the mature Frege on board, in the sense that we find the context principle in the mature Frege, since theorizing, serious systematic theorizing about sense and reference, that's not so clearly present in the Grundlage. So if you want to argue, as I do, that the context principle has got to be compatible with a substantive counter-reference and not just a deflationary counter-reference, then it's very important for me that we find the context principle in the works of Frege, where he had started to engage in serious theorizing about reference. Right? So this is where it really, really matters that we find the context principle in the Grundgesetz. All right. Attempt number 2 then to answer our big question. Maybe I'll go over that relatively quickly and then spend some time on my own favorite attempt at the end. So this is the idea of recarving content that I alluded to already, and it comes up really, really nicely in this passage from the Grundlage. So thus we replace the symbol for parallelism by the more generic symbol, identity, through removing what is specific in the content of the former and dividing it between the two line terms in B. We carve up the content in a way different from the original way, and this yields us a new concept. So you somehow take a linguistic content, one just about one line being parallel with another line, and somehow you carve that content in a new way now. Right? You cut it in a certain way, and then lo and behold, you get a new content, which is that of an identity statement, and where you have direction terms, not just line terms, flanking that direction, that identity statement. So that's the idea. Could that somehow be used to explain our big question? Right? So how come we manage to explain reference to directions by a story in which directions don't figure? Well, you start with this story in which directions don't figure. Then you recarve that, and out you get your directions. Right? So then one would be back in business, so to speak, if you could give that kind of explanation. There's another passage where this comes up, but let me skip that one now. A natural worry to have about the kind of recarving idea is it compatible with the laws of logic? Right? You take one content, you recarve it in a funky way, and will then the new content that you have be one where the laws of logic still apply? Right? So might you not have recarved it in a way that's prohibited by the laws of logic? Very good question. course, a very good answer. So in the simple and cooperative case that I said I would restrict my attention to, namely that of predicated abstraction principles, like just the direction case, you can prove that there is no problem. I'm not going to go over that, but believe me. So nothing to worry about there. The more serious worries are philosophical and not technical at this point. So here's a nice worry. So you're trying to explain how it can be that you refer to directions by a recarving story. So then you want to have contents that are somehow coarse-grained enough to be recarved. Right? So the two sides of an abstraction principle. This line is parallel with that line, firstly, and then secondly, one direction is identical with another direction. They would have the same content. Right? So the notion of content has to be quite coarse-grained. But then simultaneously, the notion of content has to be fine-grained enough to be able to start with the content, then look at the logical form of an identity statement that you've got on the other side of your abstraction principle, and then somehow retrieve your reference from that. But there's simply no way to have it both ways. To have the notion of content be coarse-grained enough for this kind of recurring story to go, while simultaneously have it be fine-grained enough to be able to retrieve the reference that you're after. This comes up quite nicely in the articles I cited here. But here's a more textual way of arguing against the idea that recarving is the key. And this is also based on my claim that the context principle survives into the Grundgesetze. So recarving simply plays no big role in the Grundgesetze. So there is talk about recarving in the earlier Frege for sure, and I read you one of the passages put up on the slides, another. But when you remember the diagrammatic presentation of what's going on in the two works, you see that where the earlier work talks about recarving meaning, the later work simply talks about taking one name, reducing that to a name that's simpler in the name that came out of in the sense that came out of the exchange with Frantescum, that is co-referring. Okay, so no talk about recarving. Recarving simply goes by the word. But the context principle does not. Right? And that very strongly indicates that the use of the context principle and the principle itself cannot be wedded to this idea of recarving. Right? Since the principle survives the abandonment of recarving. So that's also not the place to go. Okay, so we've looked then at two of the attempts then to answer our big question that you find in the literature: deflationism and recarving. And that leaves us really at this point. So I've argued against answer number one, argued against answer number two, and then I'll spend my remaining time, and people told me 45 minutes to an hour, is that?
Yeah, you've got
So,
15 minutes.
Up to
less.
15, yeah. So I'll certainly use no more than 15 to wrap it up. And I'll then say a bit about how I think an answer to our big question may be possible. But at this point, I'll ease up a little bit on my scholarship or the extent to which I'm making exegetical claims. Right? So at this point, I'll really be happy to make claims that are broadly consonant with what Frege is doing. Right? And I'm no longer saying that this is really interpreting what Frege was doing. So the kind of answer I'll propose to the big question is something you can label as internalist. So it's based on the idea that the reference of a certain language form, like direction terms, that can only be specified drawing on that very language form in question. Right? And that this is really a completely general phenomenon. So if you're interested in singular terms referring to physical bodies, right? So this chair, I use that in an attempt to refer to the chair, and then Francesca asked me, how do you know that that really refers? And explain to me how that reference is possible. Then at the end of the day, there's no way for me to account for reference to that chair, not availing myself of the very language form in question, namely terms that are in the business of referring to physical bodies. Since how else could you talk about the referent? And the idea will be to make a similar move concerning directions. That the only way of accounting for reference to directions, at some point we will have to make use of direction terms. But that's really just the label and glossing. So now for some of the details. So we'll start with an account of how a community that doesn't at the outset refer to directions. They're a community of nominalists, referring just to physical objects. And you may take the lines that I'm talking about here to be physical lines in physical space, if you wish. Right, so we start with a community of people talking just about physical objects. And I'm going to describe how that community could gradually come to expand the language in such a way as to also refer to abstract objects such as directions. So they start out with a nominalistic language, L0, which will be our base language. And this will be first order language with identity. There's going to be a semantic interpretation of that language, then saying that certain singular terms refer to certain objects, predicates are true of certain objects, all the usual Tarskian stuff. Right? And that will have a domain D0 of physical objects that these speakers are referring to and quantifying. And then something happens. The community expands their language. Maybe they're tired of just saying that. So instead of asking which direction is north, they constantly have to find circumlocutions like, could you please produce a line that is parallel to another line that points north, or something like that. That's kind of bothersome. So it would be very, very nice if they could simply get over their nominalistic scruples and speak the direction language. Right? And they're not very philosophical, they just want to be able to speak the language. They don't really care about how it's to be interpreted semantically or anything. They just want to speak it for communicative purposes. So the language here will be